instead of this. No? Yes. No, was that screen that you were just on? Okay, welcome and thank you all so much for joining us for today's Zoom conference with Professor Robert Watson, titled The Nazi Titanic, the incredible story, untold story of a doomed ship in World War II. My name is Rabbi Zalman Mendelson, and I have the pleasure of serving as the co-director of the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming, together with my wife, Razy, who is here with us. It is wonderful to see many familiar faces, as well as those of you who are joining us for the very first time. Our mission at the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming is to share the beauty of Jewish tradition, history, education, and Torah with the Jewish community of Wyoming and beyond. Most importantly, during these challenging times, we know that these events are particularly important, bringing us all together in a state of unity. Now more than ever, how precious that unity is. A few housekeeping items before we begin our interview with Professor Watson. First, I'd like to thank Elon Wood for the time and effort he has put into making this event possible. Second, I want to share with you two of our upcoming events that we'll have in the upcoming days and weeks. On June 9th at 7:30 p.m., we are going to be hosting an event titled Music and Storytelling with Brandon Goldberg, a 14-year-old award-winning pianist. A date and time has not yet been announced, but we will be hosting shortly an event titled COVID-19 in Teton County and its health effect on our community with Dr. Bruce Hayes. Please mark your calendars, and if you are in a position to be able to join us, we would love to have you. The schedule for this evening will begin with a half-hour presentation from Professor Watson. During the 30-minute presentation, please send in your questions into the chat box that you would like the professor to answer today. Please do not send in questions that are partisan, separative, in some way bring people apart, because we at Chabad believe in including everyone. After the formal presentation is over, we will ask as many questions that are submitted into the chat box to Professor Watson. As many of you know, the Jewish community now here in Jackson and throughout Wyoming struggling during these uncertain times. Please consider making a one-time tax-deductible contribution to our Chabad Jewish Center, the Rabbi's Discretionary Fund, so we can support our community with dignity during these challenging times. Today, we sent out many packages of food to Jewish people who are struggling, and your donation at jewishwyoming.com/donate will enable us to continue doing so. Finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Robert Watson. Professor Watson is a professor, author, and frequent media commentator. Professor Watson is the author and editor of 36 books on topics in American politics and history, 3 novels, and has published hundreds of scholarly articles, book chapters, essays, and newspaper editorials. A frequent media commentator, he has been interviewed by local, national, and international print, TV, and radio outlets, including, but not limited to, CNN, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, Fox News, The New York Times, BBC, USA Today. For many years, he was a Sunday columnist for the Sun Sentinel newspaper and analyst for WFTL 850 AM, WIOD 610 AM, which I used to listen to growing up in Miami, and WPBT2 PBS. He's the political analyst for WPTV5 NBC. Professor Watson has served on the boards of many academic journals and presidential foundations, such as the Calvin Coolidge Memorial Foundation, Harry Truman Foundation, Western Social Science Association, International Abraham Lincoln Journal, the Social Science Journal, and others, and was the founder and editor of the journal White House Studies. He has convened or co-convened a half-dozen national conferences on the American presidency, directed the annual Truman Legacy Symposium at the Harry S. Truman Little White House, hosted many community town halls on current issues, and organized civic, education programs for school children. In short, Professor Watson is a mensch par excellence, a great thinker who has spoken at many important universities, and it is our great honor and pleasure to warmly welcome Professor Robert Watson to our community on this beautiful Jackson Hole evening. Please put your hands together for our guest of honor, Professor Robert Watson.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. That was a wonderful introduction. I bring greetings to everybody from hot, sunny South Florida. We miss you down here, Rabbi. If I had my druthers, I think I'd be out with you in one of my favorite places in the country, Jackson Hole. Also, thank you for the invitation. Ever since this COVID crisis struck, although my family and I have been practicing proper social distancing, we don't like the term social distancing. We should be calling it physical distancing because, as you said, now more than ever, socially we need to be supporting one another. So I'm happy to share with you the story of one of my books, and I've now over 40 books, but I will never in my life come up with such a story as this. All historians dream about, going into a library or an archive and finding some declassified document or some gem from history. And I was fortunate enough to stumble across something that I know that I'll never meet it. So here's how the story happened. I have spent my entire 30-year career saying that quite simply, there's more we don't know about history than we do know. This is even for events as remarkable and as huge as World War II and the Holocaust. Even though World War II was the first conflict to have embedded reporting and real-time feedback, even though the Holocaust was the world's worst instance of genocide, there's still stories we don't know. Think of it this way. With the Holocaust, there's at least 6 million stories that will never be told. So there's still more we don't know than we do know. So I wanted to write a book on World War II, and I wanted to write a book on the Holocaust. As an historian, that's irresistible to me. I've written on the Civil War, the Revolution, other topics that I feel are that important. So I was first going to write the book on World War II and then write the book on the Holocaust. Never got around to either one because I found this. So my book on World War II was going to be as follows. The one aspect of the Second World War that we don't know much about, in fact, the only aspect, is the final days in Europe. Why? The Nazis, as we all know, were meticulous record keepers, but not in the last week. They were too busy dying, running, committing suicide, and trying to save their backsides. The British kept meticulous records, but the British, the Americans, the Allies were racing in from the West, from the South, and the Red Army from the East. So the last week in Europe, that last days in April, first week in May, were absolutely chaotic. And therefore, there's a lot we don't know. So what I thought I wanted to do was write a book about the last few days in Europe, starting on April 30th, when Hitler committed suicide. Bit down on a cyanide capsule, shot himself in the head, body burned in the garden. The trifecta, the hat trick. And I wanted to end up a week or so later with VE Day in Europe. Then what I wanted to do is each day in those last several days, I wanted to tell one story of love and one story of loss to try to, show proper respect to such a momentous week in world history. So I'm digging around trying to find a story of maybe against all odds, two folks survived a concentration camp and married. Maybe against all odds, a baby was born at the end of the war. Who was the last soldier killed? These are the stories I was looking for. And I find a letter from a major in the British Army. His name was Major Till. And Major Till writes that of all the horrors in the war, nothing prepared him for what he saw in the final hours of the war. And I thought, what is this disaster that he's talking about? And he described thousands of people dying, mostly Holocaust survivors. And I thought, now wait a minute, I know World War II, I know the Holocaust, I've never heard of such a thing. So what I did was what I always do, I try to go to the source. I called the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, the World War II Museum in New Orleans, I called the Imperial War Museum in London. I contacted Yad Vashem and said, what is he talking about? And everybody said, must be a fraudulent letter. There was no such tragedy. So I continue with my research, but I can't get this out of my head. Shortly thereafter, again by dumb luck, I come across a letter from a general in the British military, 6th Commando. He's in charge of a special forces unit. His name is General Mills Roberts. And he writes that he was on the beaches in north central Germany, southern Baltic, and watched thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors all be brutally murdered as the war was ending. And I thought, that's impossible. This didn't happen. But now there's 2 letters. So what's the likelihood? So what I did was I went back and looked up Till's unit and Mills Roberts' unit. And as you all probably know, if you had any loved one that served in uniform, you can track these units and find out, were they at D-Day, were they at the Battle of the Bulge, and so on. So I tracked both units all the way through the war. And when you get to the last days of the war, all the records disappear. So I'm thinking that's either one heck of a coincidence or something is classified. Long story short, I dig and I dig and I dig, and all the evidence points to classified documents, perhaps in London. So I'm calling the Royal Archives in London. I'm emailing, I'm writing them letters, telling them that I think you're sitting on this momentous story, maybe one of the bigger stories of the war and the Holocaust, and my guess is it's still classified. And every time I call, they hang up the phone like I'm a crazy person. So I call and I say, don't hang up. A couple of my books have won awards. I'm a professor. I have this, can't get through. So I'm so frustrated. I'm contemplating breaking into the Royal Archives in London like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, floating down from the ceiling, although I weigh a lot more than he did, so the rope would probably break. So I'm really frustrated. Meanwhile, I get a wonderful gig. I'm lecturing at D-Day for the 70th anniversary of the Normandy invasion. So I'm at D-Day and I'm out on the beach and I meet a woman there who is fascinating. She's on the board of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. She's an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. Has anybody seen the film on the Kinder transport into the arms of strangers? That's hers, Deborah Oppenheimer. And I said, wow, I'm honored to meet you. I love your film. I show it to my students and teach them about the Kinder transport through her movie. And she says, I said, listen, would you mind joining me for dinner tonight? And I said, if you don't mind, my wife and kids are along. She said, not at all. My parents are along. And she's around my age, which is to say youthful 50s. So we meet for dinner and in walks Deborah with Eric and Gloria Oppenheimer. I run here in South Florida a weekly lecture series for anywhere from 500 to 1,700 people. And sitting in the front row every single week for years, Eric and Gloria Oppenheimer. Deborah's mother was a Kinder survivor. Father was a World War II vet. And I look at them and I said, Eric and Gloria, what on earth are you doing here? And then I put one and one together. I said, you mean to tell me this is your daughter? You didn't tell me all these years that your daughter won the Academy Award. What kind of Jewish mother are you? And Deborah looks at me and she goes, you're that guy? They read all the books and go to the lectures. And I go, yeah, they need to get out more socially. So we sit down and Deborah says, listen, my parents like your books. So tell me what you're working on. So I told her what I just told you in great detail. And I said, I know there's something there, but I can't get access. So she says, oh, don't worry. Let me make a call. I know Prince Charles. I know Dame Judi Dench. I know Sir Attenborough. And I'm going, boy, she's had too much French wine. 2 days later, I check my email. I get an email from the Imperial War Museum and the Royal Archives in London. They say, Debbie called. She said, you're her buddy and we're supposed to help you out, that you found something. So they asked me what to look for. And I wanted to tell them, hey, I've been calling you guys for weeks and weeks and weeks, but I've resisted. And I told them exactly what I thought I had found, where I thought it might be, etc. 2 days after that, I get a contact from them, a call from them. Eureka, they found it. Get this, 700 to 800 pages of top secret classified records from the final hours of World War II. And they were sitting in the basement of the archives for 7 decades. So, after I picked myself up off the floor, here's what was in those records and what's in my book. They asked me, what do you want to do with all this? And, I'm an easygoing person. If I go out to dinner and they bring me the wrong meal, I just shut up and eat it. But I figured this is the ninth inning. It's the World Series. So I said, I want complete access to all these documents. And then when I'm done, you can open them up to the world. And they go, okay. I couldn't believe it. So here's what I found. In the 1920s, Germany built a replica of the Titanic. She was called the Cap, C-A-P, Arcona, A-R-C-O-N-A, named for Cape Arcona in the southern Baltic, northern German coast. Now, Germany was the belligerent during World War I. Therefore, because they started it, Germany was severely punished by the victors. Deindustrialization, demilitarization. Their ships, they had to pay war reparations. Their ships were taken from them. Now, Germany has always prided itself in its ships. And some of the world's greatest shipping builders in the late 1800s and early 1900s were German companies. Blum and Voss, the great German shipping company, Hamburg, South America, or Hamburg Sud, S-U-D. So the fact that Germany lost its ships really put it on its knees. So after the war, Blum and Voss were going to build the world's greatest ship, in part to try to get Germany's economy up and running, but in part for national pride. And they built the Cap Arcona. They studied the Titanic to make a replica. She looks just like the Titanic, only 3 funnels instead of 4. The grand staircase, the chandeliers, the 7-course dinners, celebrities, American film stars, European monarchs sailed on her, probably the wealthy folks from Jackson Hole and from South Florida. So she was this famous ship. And she was known as the Queen of the South Atlantic, the Floating Palace, just quite a remarkable ship. She makes about 93 transatlantic crossings going to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. There's even a tango composed in her honor, and she has a tango band in addition to a full orchestra on board the ship. So that's the Titanic, rather, this Cap Arcona. Well, in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, it turns out that he loves big ships. He sees this ship as a symbol of German might and pride. He uses it for propaganda purposes, tasking his sick propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, to tell the world, your Titanic sunk, ours is still afloat. So Hitler starts to nickname the ship the Nazi Titanic. Now, when the war starts in 1939, September 1, with the invasion of Poland, Hitler doesn't want to lose this magnificent ship. Other ocean liners and commercial and merchant ships, they put guns and cannons on them, paint them camouflaged, and continue to sail them. Not this one. They don't want to lose the Nazi Titanic. So they take it to the Polish coast in what is near today Gdynia. Back then, the Germans renamed it Gottenhafen, on the Polish coast in the southern Baltic. And they let all the paint peel off. They take all the Persian rugs out and the chandeliers and the gold. And there she sits and she kind of rusts. The ship is used as a floating naval platform, but she's safe. Now, all that would change in 1942. In a rare moment of lucidity, Hitler has a meeting with Goebbels and other senior leaders and says to them, we may lose this thing, the war. We need something so epic, so diabolical. We need a game changer, basically. And he tasks Goebbels to come up with something that'll make the world hate the British and the Americans and love the Nazis. Now, what is this something? Hitler doesn't know and Goebbels doesn't know. They're thinking about it. Here's what they do know something about: Hollywood movies. Hitler and Goebbels were whacked for Hollywood movies. Even during the war, it was not unusual for the two of them to sit up at night and watch 3 back-to-back-to-back Hollywood blockbusters. Hitler even tasked Goebbels with building Hollywood on the Rhine, Babelsberg. He said, we're going to show Jewish Hollywood that we make better movies. So they were crazy about movies. The favorite movies that the two of them watched, as best as I could tell from the record, they loved Gone with the Wind, they loved King Kong, and get this, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You can't make this stuff up. She was a German maiden in the Black Forest, right? So they watched those movies all the time. The movie that the two of them hated was Casablanca, right? Because if you've seen Casablanca, it's a great film, but essentially it's an anti-Nazi film, an anti-Nazi propaganda film. But you don't realize it because it's wrapped up with great writing, great acting, great directing, great cinematography. They hated Casablanca. Goebbels used to kick over the chairs in the studio whenever they watched it. So one day they're watching a movie, and typically the two of them would sit for an hour after watching a movie and debate the script and cinematography. They considered themselves connoisseurs of film, Germany's Siskel and Ebert, if you will. And I hope you get that reference. My students would have no idea what I'm talking about. So they watched this one movie. Now, sadly, they didn't say what the movie was. And I must have spent 6 months trying to find out what the film was, but those records are gone. But what Goebbels wrote was, after they watched this movie, it left them so emotionally drained. Think of when you saw Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan. It left them so emotionally drained that instead of debating the movie, the two of them just sat there, exhausted, and watched the title run, the credits run. And Goebbels wrote that something horrible happened. When they watched the credits, he realized that all the great producers and directors, all the great actors and cinematographers, all the great screen and script writers were Jewish. And Goebbels said that he kicked over all the chairs in the room again. But that's when Hitler had the idea, that's it. That's what the great thing is we're going to do. You, Goebbels, are going to make the world's greatest propaganda film. Beyond Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. You're going to make a propaganda film that's going to make the world love the Allies, hate the Allies, and love the Axis. Now, so that's the task that Goebbels has. But Hitler tells Goebbels, I don't want the usual propaganda film. If anybody's seen Der Wigger Jude, The Eternal Jew, Jude Seuss, Seuss the Jew, these are some of Goebbels's, the 100 movies that he churned out. They were sophomoric at best, ham-fisted, disgusting, repulsively anti-Semitic. All of them had the same storyline, an idyllic little German Hamlet until a Jew moves in. And the Jewish character always looks like a Dracula figure and bad things happen until the people, like in every Dracula movie, rise up, march on his house and drive him out. Everybody lives happily ever after. So it's so obvious that Hitler says, I don't want one of those. Here's what I want you to make. Another Casablanca, an action, drama, romance hybrid that people don't realize they're getting a propaganda film. So around that same time, there's a German film writer and loyal Nazi whose name is Bratt, B-R-A-T-T. He's working on a script for a German version of the Titanic. Hitler and Goebbels get a hold of it and they say, that's it. Long before James Cameron figured out the Titanic would forever be of interest, Goebbels and Hitler did. So they made the Nazi Titanic. Now, they already had a star for their film, didn't they? They had a replica of the Titanic sitting off the Polish coast. So they repaint her, put the chandeliers and all the opulence back in the ship, and they have a life-size star of the movie. Now, they hire the most handsome German matinee actors, the most beautiful models. They reassign carpenters and people to make the sets. Hitler even allows military units, a unit of the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, and a unit of the Wehrmacht, the Army, to be reassigned as extras. They wanted to make one of those Cecil B. DeMille-esque cast of thousands, right, everyone? The greatest story ever told kind of a thing. So in the middle of the war, Hitler gives an unlimited budget to Goebbels, and they reassign military units. Now, the one thing they realize they don't have is a director. They have a star, the ship, the Nazi Titanic, but they don't have a director. Goebbels would write that they realized that all of Germany's great directors had either defected or been put into concentration camps. So they find a guy named Herbert Selpin, Selpin. He's known as the Hedgehog. He's a short, disagreeable, but talented director. And Selpin's perfect for it because he makes action, drama, romance type of films. I went back and watched two of the films he made with English subtitles, and he was basically making Indiana Jones. You know, a dashing professor, and aren't they all? Goes to Africa, meets the girl, fights the locals, finds the treasure, you know, Indiana Jones. So they pick Herbert Selpin to make the movie. Now, fortunately for history, everything that could go wrong goes wrong. One of the lead actresses gets pregnant from one of the soldiers. The sailors get drunk one day and wreck the set. They want to film the sinking of the Titanic, of course, at night for realism. The problem is to film at night, you need those big stage lights. But all of Germany is under mandatory blackout because of Allied bombing. Hitler and Goebbels give Herbert Selpin an exemption, and he lights up the set, and the Allies bomb it. So they're running behind schedule, over cost. Everything's going wrong with this epic Nazi Titanic movie that's going to change the war. Finally, one day, Herbert Selpin shows up on set, and everything had gone wrong on set. And Selpin had been drinking. So he blows a gasket. He curses Hitler, curses Goebbels, curses the Nazi party. Well, you know, the Gestapo and spies are everywhere. Selpin is summoned to Joseph Goebbels' office in Berlin, and they hang him. Now, surprisingly, they can't find another director to take over. They finally find a B movie guy named Werner Klingner, and he finishes the movie. Goebbels finally gets his long-awaited masterpiece, the Nazi Titanic, which is going to change the war. He watches it before giving it to the Fuhrer, and he is shocked. What he realizes is Herbert Selpin, the director, from the grave, has the last laugh. There was propaganda in the movie, all right, including anti-Nazi propaganda. And Goebbels realizes a film about a fanatical captain, i.e. Hitler, leading his doomed passengers, the people of Germany, into an iceberg, World War II, the parallel is too real. So Hitler orders that all copies of it be banned and destroyed. Fortunately, pirated copies make it to Paris and Prague, and today you can see it with English subtitles. So the movie actually still exists, but it was never used by Hitler as intended. The movie is difficult to watch because we know what's happening, but you can actually see the Nazi Titanic in it. Quite frankly, I think this movie is a technical masterpiece, but wretchedly horrific and inhumane to watch. Now, you all know in the 1950s, there was a British film called A Night to Remember about the Titanic. Anybody? Is anybody old enough to remember the 50s? I'm guessing nobody out there is, right? They're all down here where I live in South Florida. So 1957, 58, A Night to Remember. I think that movie is way better than James Cameron's, and here's why. Get this. All the ship and sinking scenes, they actually took the real footage from the Nazi Titanic movie. Hey, Hitler and Goebbels no longer had copyright, right? So you can actually see the ship. And Goebbels and Selpin wanted to sink the ship and film people dying on it for realism. They were Nazis after all. Okay, so that was the movie. After the movie, the Nazi Titanic, the ship, is taken back to the Polish coast, and there she sits and rusts until the last months of the war. Winter, 1945, January through March, is one of the most hopeful yet horrendous periods in world history. It's apparent that World War II will end badly for the Nazis, but this is when Hitler issues his infamous liquidation decree, right, everybody? Any concentration camp not yet liberated must be liquidated. And that means all the people inside, all the documents, the camp, everything else. And we still don't know, history still doesn't know how many thousands upon thousands upon thousands of concentration camp survivors were brutally murdered in those months as the war's coming to an end. Now, Heinrich Himmler enters our story. Himmler sends this cryptic letter, the head of the Gestapo. He sends this cryptic letter to concentration camp commandants, saying, if your camp is not yet liberated or liquidated, don't let the concentration camp prisoners fall into enemy hands. What does he mean? He wants to move thousands, up to 20,000 survivors. He wants to move them to the Baltic coast and put them on a ship. Does this mean that Himmler cares? Of course not. Here's what he wants to do. Himmler wants to save his own rear end. In April of 45, as the war is coming to an end, he wants tens of thousands of survivors taken to the German coast, and he wants everybody put on a ship. He's going to get on the ship and sail the ship, presumably to England, and offer a negotiation. I will give you thousands of survivors in exchange for my life. He also wants a conditional surrender on the Western Front, as if we would have offered a conditional surrender. So this is Himmler's crazy plan. So thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors are sent by foot, by cattle car train, by barge, to a place called Neuengamme, KZ Neuengamme, Neuengamme. It's a massive concentration camp, brick-making camp near Hamburg in north central Germany. And from there, they're marched on a death march to the Baltic coast to a place called Lübeck, L-U-B-E-K, Bay, and the port of Neustadt, New City, Neustadt. Now, we don't know exactly how many. I guess that upwards of 5,000 to 10,000 died on that death march. The Nazis are rushing them at a horrific pace because they know the war's ending. When they get to the Baltic, Himmler had ordered a ship brought to the Baltic coast. Guess which ship? The Nazi Titanic, of course, Hitler's favorite ship. That ship is big enough to carry this many people. Now, the Nazi Titanic is so big that she cannot dock at Neustadt. She has to drop anchor 3 kilometers out in the Baltic. And every day in the last days of April and first days of May, there's this, scene out of Dante's Inferno, where hundreds of survivors are taken out and loaded on the ship, crammed below decks with no light, no food, no water, and then dozens, if not hundreds more, are thrown overboard. They're dead. Then another boat comes out, bringing hundreds more, bringing more bodies back, hundreds more bodies back, every couple hours, all day for the last couple days of the war. So there could be anywhere from 4,000 to 10,000 people alive on the ship, and thousands of bodies are in the water and washing up on the beaches. Now, Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, as we said, and the ship is sitting there in early May, and no one knows what to do. There's 2 Nazis in charge of the port. Karl Kaufmann, with a K and a K, is the head politician, and a Gestapo official named Count George von Basewitz-Behr, B-E-H-R. The 2 of those Nazis meet and they say, we don't want all these survivors. We don't want to be responsible. The war's all but over. So they come up with a plan. Let's fill that ship with gas, fill it with every survivor, and when we're forced to surrender, we're going to blow it up, scuttle it, and put her on the bottom of the Baltic. The world will forget about the Titanic because so many will die on the Nazi Titanic. It'll be a final FU to the world. And we will deny the Allies from getting the Führer's beloved Nazi Titanic. So here we are on May 3, D-, the war is almost over. On May 3, the British 6th Commando, Special Forces Unit. Do you remember the letter from Major Till at the beginning of my talk? He's in command. They storm the beaches and they wipe out the Nazis at the port. It's not the Wehrmacht, the regular military, it's the Volkssturm. That's a couple teenage boys and a couple old men with World War I rifles. And the British 6th Commando makes quick work of them. They're mopping up the remaining vestiges of the Nazis in town. Unfortunately, a group of young naval cadets and some Hitler Youth teenagers elude the 6th Commando and race off into the woods. But the British clear everybody else out. As they're doing that, people at the port are telling them, do you see that ship out there? There are thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors on that ship, and they're dying hundreds by the day. You got to get out there. As the British are ready to take a boat out to the ship, there is a deafening roar. They all look upward and the skies blacken. 6 squadrons of British bombers, Mark 1B Typhoons, fly into the Baltic and blow up the Nazi Titanic. 6 squadrons. The ship is exploded with all that fuel. It lifts her up out of the water, back in. A Titanic-like hole is gouged out, and she starts rolling over. Thousands of people are killed instantly on the ship. Those below decks, when the water pours in, the water's 42 degrees Fahrenheit in May. They survived the Holocaust. They survived the death march. They survived days in the ship without food and water. Most perish immediately of hypothermia, or they freeze and drown in the water. As the ship's rolling over and sinking, the suction from the ship is pulling everyone else underneath the ship. Monstrous explosions. Those that make it into the water and are holding on to something that floats to try to kick their way the 3 kilometers to the coast, they are strafed by British RAF machine guns. A Typhoon bomber is not, if anybody's a World War II fan, it's not a big bomber like a B-17, B-24, or a British Lancaster, but it's not a small fighter like a British Spitfire or an American P-51. It's like a hybrid. It's mid-size. A little too big to be a good fighter, a little too small to be a good bomber. It's specialized in attacking tanks, trains, and ships. They have machine guns on the wing, so they strafe all the people in the water. Then they scream down the port. There's thousands of people with striped concentration camp uniforms on at the port waving, and they strafe and machine gun everybody at the port and go back to their bases. Thousands and thousands of people are dead in the water, at the port, and on the sinking Nazi Titanic. Amazingly, a handful of people make it off this boat. 2 of them are brothers. They're Polish, Berek and Józef Jakubowicz. They survived Auschwitz, other camps, the death march, and days in the ship. They're teenagers. They're below decks in a crowded hold. And when the water starts pouring in, they said almost everybody had been dead. They've been in there for days. They are treading water floating up to the ceiling. The problem is when they look up at the ceiling, the hatches are closed. So they're ready to take their last breath, but some brave comrades, some other Holocaust survivors, despite what they've been through, go below decks and open up the hatch. They reach down and pull Berek and Józef Jakubowicz out. The 2 Jakubowicz brothers and their rescuers go racing through the ship. Now the ship's rolling over and sinking, so you can't go to the top of the ship, you have to go to the bottom. Do you remember the Poseidon Adventure movie, everybody? And they're holding their breath under the water, it's on fire. They finally get to a hallway, and the flames are basically burning everyone. The Jakubowicz brothers manage to climb up through an air duct in the ceiling, but all their rescuers are killed, burned. They get to the outside deck of the ship. As the ship's rolling, they have to shimmy on the deck to the bottom of the ship as she's rolling over. Now, the problem is the steel underside of the ship, because of the flames and explosions, it's so hot, it's cooking people alive. So Berek, the older brother, tells Józef, we need to get off the ship. Józef can't swim. So Berek goes down the anchor line into the water, and they give their brotherly goodbyes. Józef says, I'm going to take my chances on the ship. Berek goes in the water and is picked up by a German fisherman who takes him to town and to a bakery. There's no food, no nothing. He's naked and freezing, but he lights an oven and wraps up in a burlap sack. I tried to get the name of the German fisherman who rescued him, that he might be listed in Yad Vashem as among the righteous. But the German fisherman was so afraid he never gave Berek the name. Berek falls asleep that night with a few other people. He wakes up in the morning when the door is kicked open. He thought he was going to die. It's not the Nazis, it's the British. They take him to the local hospital, and guess who's in the hospital? His brother, Józef. That night, the British went out to the ship and rescued Józef off the ship. The only thing that kept him from burning to death, he piled up the dead and sat on top of them so he wouldn't burn from the heat. Józef and Berek are reunited. They move to Boston. They marry, have kids, successful careers, and live a long life. As of about 2 years ago, I called Berek's widow, and she was still alive. There was one more fellow, as I bring this to an end. His name was Francis Akos, A-K-O-S. He was the principal violinist in the Budapest Jewish Symphony. He was captured as a kid, survived many camps, survived the death march, survived the ship. He's blown into the water. He and other folks managed to swim to the shore. Think about this, everyone. 3 kilometers in the frigid Baltic. Michael Phelps couldn't do that. This is remarkable courage and strength. They make it to the beaches. The problem when they make it to the beaches, do you remember there was a group of Hitler Youth and young naval cadets who escaped from the British 6th Commando? They show up at the beach and they're killing everybody at the beach. They run out of bullets, so they use the butts of their guns. So as Francis Akos and others are treading water, thinking they're about to die, the British 6th Commando shows up. General Mills Roberts, the letter I found. And Mills Roberts would write that it was the only time in his career in uniform that he wasn't a gentleman or an officer. He said, "We take no prisoners," when he saw what the Nazis were capable of. And he wrote, "These teenage boys in the Hitler Youth and naval cadets, with their last breath on earth, rather than fight back against the British, rather than try to save the people under the butts of their gun, rather than run and save their lives, with their last breath, they chose to kill whichever survivors were on the beach," which really says something. Mills Roberts rescues Francis Akos. He moves to Chicago and becomes the first chair violinist and then concertmaster of the Chicago Philharmonic. Just died a few years ago. In closing, just when you think you know all there is to know about the Holocaust, history still has her secrets, including some whoppers. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am so rational. I need multiple sources before I put a single word in any of my books. How could the British have done this? In some ways, it was the perfect storm. It was cloudy and rainy. The conditions were horrible that day. The British bombers had to drop down to about 1,000 feet. If you're that low, everyone, you're susceptible to anti-aircraft machine gun fire. So they dropped down low, hit the ship quick, and got out. Secondly, the Britain had lost so many pilots that they were getting 19 and 20-year-olds and putting them in the cockpit. These boys were scared to death. They weren't thinking straight. The commander of the 6 squadrons of bombers was the old man of the group. He was 23. His name was Johnny Baldwin. Next, there had been rumors that the Nazis were going to flee to Norway for a final redoubt, a last stand. And they would use ships and then the geographic isolation, mountains and fjords of Norway to dig in. So intelligence reported that. So a lot of these pilots said, we saw the biggest ship we've ever seen in our lives, and we were going to sink it. They should have recognized who were in the striped pajamas on the ship and on the shore. So this is what we found. I'm happy to say that it's all been declassified. I went to New York City and addressed a group of about 250 rabbis, JCC, Holocaust Museum directors. I've turned over all the literature. We did the National Jewish Book Council tour, a couple dozen Holocaust museums around the world, releasing information, telling the story. And we need to continue to tell all these stories, right, everyone? So that never again truly means never again. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. This was really fascinating, horrendously fascinating, remarkably terrible. If anybody has questions, if you could write it in the chat box and we'll try and call on you live in order to ask your question directly to Professor Watson. Adam Gastel, do you want to come on mic and ask your question?
Hello, Professor. I'm actually down in South Florida myself. I'm not sure where you're at, but I'm in West Palm Beach. So
I'm in Boca Raton. I'm just down the road.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Very familiar. I lived in Wyoming for 2.5 years. That's how I'm friendly with the rabbi. So the question I have is, had you not been in contact with the British archives, is it safe to assume that they were just sitting there essentially collecting dust and nothing was being studied at all? 'Cause this is
Yes. So here's what you have. In the United States, yeah, Well, here's what you have. So good question, Adam. In the United States, you can file a Freedom of Information Act request.
Yes.
You get access to the Smithsonian National Archives, and I've done that to write my books for years. Everybody that does what I do for a living does it. In England, they have a 30-year national secrets rule. And here's what it says. Something that's classified top secret, after 30 years, they declassify it. But here was the problem. Think, Adam, of the end of World War II. Millions of documents, records, Nazi pistols, IDs, all that is loaded up at the end of the war by young guys who miss their moms, miss their girlfriends. They get a forklift, they load them on a ship, take it to Southampton, drive it to London, and just put it in boxes and fill it up down there. If you go to the basement of the Royal Archives of the National Archives, it looks a lot like that scene in Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. You remember the last scene when they put the Ark in like sub-basement 20 with millions of other boxes? I don't think the British were trying to keep I think they tried to make it a secret when it happened. They were too embarrassed that as the war ended, they were embarrassed. They classified it top secret, and they collected all the records from the general, all the pilots, everybody. It was all in that box that we got a hold of. But I think after 30 years, there were so many millions of documents from 1945. In 1975, they just missed it. It was marked on the side of the box, get this, Adam, not to be opened until the year 2045, making it a 100-year secret. Now, when I contacted them, when they finally got my info, they immediately declassified everything. So it leads me to believe that they weren't, from a conspiracy perspective, still trying to keep this shut. I think they didn't know they had it. Remember, if something's not digitized today, it doesn't exist. You know, if a tree falls in the woods and an historian's not there to write down the sound, it doesn't make one, right? So I think they just missed it along with the millions of other documents. And by some miracle, it was, they declassified it and we were able to read all that. And it was a hellacious read, as you can imagine, and then write this book. So thank you.
Any other questions? If anybody else has any questions, just unmute yourself. I think, Professor Watson, people are really just in shock of hearing this piece of history that we all knew nothing about.
I was the same way. You know, I contacted Yad Vashem, the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I always try to go to the source. I just finished a book on George Washington. So I call the people at Mount Vernon, go to the source. And it's shocking to me that people didn't know this story. Now, there were some things online, but none of it was written by a scholar. None of it was footnoted, cited, nothing refereed. So, you know, we don't apply that type of work. If it's not refereed, if you don't have primary sources, it doesn't exist. But I was shocked. And I even called several rabbis I know. I called World War II scholars I know. I called everybody. In fact, one of the first people we called was Michael Berenbaum. He is considered to be the top scholar at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So I asked Debbie Oppenheimer, this Hollywood filmmaker, and a couple of rabbis I'm friends with, I said, who would you say is the top Holocaust scholar? And several of them said Michael Berenbaum. So I called him and I said, would you go through my book for me and let me know how it is? Because I'm not a Holocaust scholar. I did not want to make a mistake with something this important. And let me make sure I have proper respect in it. And I'm happy to say Michael Berenbaum could not have been more helpful. I also asked the rabbis, who would you say is one of the most famous rabbis? And although they would have said Rabbi Zalman, they said Rabbi Gordis, if you know that name. And I sent it to Rabbi Gordis, and he wrote a review of it too and read it through for me. So I got a lot of people to put eyes on this thing because I'm not a Holocaust scholar. I've written about the creation of Israel. I've written about Hamilton's Jewish roots. I lecture about the Holocaust. But you know, I was happy to say that people really came out and were fascinated by it and really were helpful. So I felt good about having all those eyes on the book, lest we make a mistake with something that's sacred. So
it's interesting that the Jakubowicz brothers never shared the story.
Here's what I found. There were about 6 books written by survivors, but they were kind of vanity press, self-published. You know what I mean? I'm not dismissing that, but And the book sold 10 copies. And they pretty much gave their kids each a copy. And so nobody knew about it. In fact, I had this great phone call right after the book came out. One of the first phone calls I got was from a young man who was a writer for The Atlantic, which is a great magazine. He calls me and he's like hyperventilating. He says, "Oh my gosh, my grandfather is on page 210 of your book." And I go, "Whoa." He said, "Yeah, he survived that. And he's still alive in Buffalo." So we quick sent a film crew to tape his oral history, right? So the question was, why didn't you ever tell anyone about this? And I feel stupid and inappropriate asking that question. As I tell my students on campus, think about the courage it takes to talk about the Holocaust. Imagine the worst thing that's ever happened to you, multiply it by 100 and tell it to strangers. What he said was, I was so traumatized, I could never talk about it. When I finally got the courage to talk about it, I went to a school to tell the kids, and the school teacher thought I was making it up because it just seemed too crazy. Could you imagine after all that? So we actually found 3 people still alive from the incident. We got them on tape. I found a widow, 2 widows actually, one in Philadelphia, one in Boston. I found a daughter of one of the survivors out in Illinois. So we tried the best we could to gather this up. But what it was almost everybody died. Those that survived, most were too traumatized to talk about it. And think about it, everyone. Nobody shared these stories until Elie Wiesel wrote Night, 1960s. Before Elie Wiesel wrote Night, people didn't share these stories. So there were a handful of people that wrote about it. It's just that the books didn't sell. That's unfortunate for history. It was fortunate for me, but unfortunate for history that their books didn't sell. So people just didn't know about it.
Hey,
Wow.
Professor, this is Elon.
Hi, Elon. Nice to talk to you in person after all of the emails. And thank you for the invitation.
Oh, well, thank you for the amazing lecture. So quick question. I like to ask historians and philosophers when I meet them what their favorite book is, or the book that they think has had the largest imprint on their work. So I pose that question to you in light of the heavy topic of tonight, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elon. Boy, that's tough picking a single book. Here's what I will say. My hero is and has always been Harry Truman. So David McCullough's book, Truman, is my favorite. The reason being is because people didn't care much for Truman until McCullough wrote the book. And then everybody loved Truman. And his ranking and those presidential ranking polls skyrocketed after the book. I serve on the Truman Foundation board and was friends with the past director of the Truman Presidential Library. I'm friends with Truman's grandson. They said the attendance at the Truman Library skyrockets after David McCullough's book. So what I liked about it so much, Elon, was David McCullough is a gifted writer, as you all know, gifted storyteller. And he really brings Harry Truman to life so that everybody can appreciate and love the Harry Truman that I've always respected. I'm also a big fan of Ron Chernow and his books on Washington, Hamilton. And I have the great honor of knowing McCullough and knowing Chernow. I don't put myself in their category, of course. But a couple of years ago, Chernow told me, and I asked him what he's working on. He said, "I'm going to write a book on Grant." And I said, "Thank you." Because Grant is also someone I've always admired who's underappreciated. And I told Chernow, "You're going to do for Grant what you did for Hamilton." My son, by the way, who's in college, is named for Alexander Hamilton. So I'm nerdy about my history. So, but I really, really, really like McCullough's book on Truman because it's a story of an uneducated, last president to lack a college degree, an uneducated, failed haberdasher and rural farmer who's raised in a racist and anti-Semitic home, who grows up to be the great friend of the larger Jewish diaspora and the president who helped make Israel possible in 1948. That is a story. So I love McCullough's book. Thanks for asking, Elon.
Thank you.
On the
Thanks, everybody.
book, please consider going to Amazon and purchasing Professor Watson's book, the Nazi Titanic, as well as many of his other books. This was really a fascinating and historically educating lecture. If anybody, I think we may have time for like 2 more questions. Is that correct, Professor?
Sure, that's fine. And thank you for plugging the book. I'll be shameless and say all proceeds cover my kids' education, their tuition.
We should all buy many of them. Your speech was fascinating. I'm sure your books are even more.
Professor Watson.
Cheryl, welcome to Jackson. Welcome home. Any questions? Any thoughts?
I see Paul Knapp has a question.
Yeah, from Lakes of Delray. You just spoke at our men's club 2 months ago.
Lakes of Delray. Paul, I'm friends with several Knapp families in South Florida.
Well, my wife and I attended many of your lectures over the year. Unfortunately, she passed away just a few months ago.
I'm sorry to hear that, and I apologize for you having to come to my lectures. Lakes of Delray.
Question for you. How do you think Truman would handle the current situation?
Let me avoid some ugly politics, but I need to say a lot differently than it's being handled now. Let me give 2 examples.
From any partisan, if we can stay away from partisan current politics.
I'll stay away from the partisanship and just say 2 things about Harry. When Truman was in the Senate, he headed the Truman Committee, which was an investigative committee to save the taxpayer money from cost overruns during the defense contracts. Truman, it's estimated, saved between $10 and $15 billion in fraud cost overruns by all these defense contractors. Truman made sure the planes, the bullets, the clothing, the uniforms got to the soldiers in the field. He was relentless. He had over 1,000 interviews, hundreds of hearings. So Truman's commitment to oversight, and remember, Truman was one of the first presidents to appoint a number of inspectors general. He wanted to make sure that things were being done the right way. And during the latter part of the New Deal, he wanted to make sure people were getting the relief they needed. So he was vigilant about oversight, transparency. And the second thing I'll say is, in terms of trying to get equipment and products to people who need it, think about Truman and the Marshall Plan, everyone. We rebuild Europe, roads, bridges, ports. They provide coal, heating oil, medicine, food for an entire continent, and it's done like that. This man's commitment to taking care of people and getting supplies where they need to be and making sure that there's proper oversight and transparency, I think it's unequaled in American history. So I think those are 2 areas that would come to the fore today, Paul.
Thank you.
And I'll see you in Lakes of Delray. Actually, I hope to see you in Jackson Hole.
Okay.
I love it out there. I'm in love with the area. If they had a university out there, I'd probably move. But Jackson Hole State. Anyone else?
People are definitely finding this very, very fascinating. Our viewers on Facebook are thanking you for this fascinating lecture. Someone in Florida wants to know, Adam actually, Costello in Florida wants to know that if he would want to attend some of your lectures locally, how would he find out more about it, or how would he be able to stay in touch?
And how generally can people stay in touch with you if they'd like to continue learning from you, if they'd like to continue supporting you, if they'd like to continue to be a part of your world? What can people do to be able to stay in touch with you? It's really important for everyone on this in this audience. They've learned so much. For them to have that opportunity would be very special. So how could they do that?
Thank you. I'm doing a series of Zoom talks this summer for the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County. You can ask for Felice or Jules, and we've done a couple already, and I've got a couple more I'm doing. Starting next month, I'll be doing a monthly program for the Mandel JCC, the Jewish Community Center in Palm Beach Gardens. I lecture there every year, so we're going to be doing a monthly Zoom program for them, and I'm doing a monthly program for the Federation of South Palm Beach County. Ordinarily, I visit a lot of libraries in South Florida once the COVID's behind us. I also do a series for Hadassah chapters in South Florida. I'm a member, an honorary Hadassah member. What you can do is I announce my programs on Facebook. It's simple hashtag on Facebook or simple link at Professor Watson. Robert Watson was taken, R. Watson was taken, Robert W. was taken. So at Professor Watson, just click on there. And I used to do about every 2 days, I'd put a historical quote up and a list of where I'm at. Now I'm not doing it as much, but I announce my programs there. So I hope to see everybody at the Jewish Federation, Palm Beach County, at the Mandel JCC in Palm Beach Gardens, and when I come out to Jackson Hole one of these summers. And Paul, hang in there, okay? I wish you strength with all that. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, ma'am.
Please put your hands together for a wonderful, fascinating, brilliant, beautiful presentation by Professor Robert Watson. What an honor and a pleasure to have him with us. And please, once again, go to Amazon.com, purchase as many books as you can for your family and friends. We would love to support the important work of Professor Watson. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and please join us in the near future at one of our upcoming Zoom events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
It's good to see you, Cheryl.
Yeah, we
Welcome
made
to
it.
Jackson.
We made it. And our 2-week quarantine is over.
Yes. Well, you let us know when you're ready to see us. We would love to see you.
We could do some not social physical distancing. Is that what we're calling it? Not social distancing.
Even if it's a hike standing 6 feet apart, we would love that.
Or you could join us for Shabbat lunch. We'll put you on a separate table.
Across the street.
No, we could eat outside on the porch.
Okay, weather permitting, we'll see.
You let us know. Our kids are going to be so excited to see you. Everyone has missed you tremendously.
Us
And
too.
very exciting for you to be back in town. We are immunity positive.
Figured. You're
So,
good. Not
yeah.
us.
No, but we're not taking, we're not giving anymore.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm gonna stop live stream on Facebook, and I'm gonna stop the recording.